as Rabbi Brzezinski said, one of the joys of living a long life and one of the challenges is grandparenting. And we are very, very pleased today to have somebody who's very dear and close to us at the OU. He happens to be a Teaneck resident. His practice is in Passaic. He is a regular at our annual marriage enhancement retreat that the OU runs. Alex's sessions are always overfilled because people, once they hear him once, want to always go back. His insight and his wisdom are legendary, at least among us at the OU. And we were thrilled that when we put this program together, Alex was able to give us some time. I'm sure you'll all find him incredibly, will give you a lot of insights that I hope will be helpful. It's really, I really want to thank him for being here, and it's a pleasure to introduce Alex Bailey.
Let me start by clarifying something that may not be clear. I'm not a grandparent, okay? I acknowledge that, and I come to you today not as a grandparent. When I give workshops, most often I'm giving workshops to some level of my peer group. So when I'm talking at the marriage retreat, I'm married. And when I give workshops in the school system to teachers and do teacher training, I educate, and I'm a teacher as well. And of course, the very successful initiative by the OU in their parenting initiative, their positive parenting initiative, as a parent, I get the privilege of talking to parents as well. Today, I present myself to you from two other perspectives. Number one is as a clinician. In my private practice, I do a lot of work with teenagers and then a lot of work with families. And one of the things that most often comes up, or at least very frequently comes up with the parents during our family sessions, are issues of dealing with their parents vis-a-vis their children. So the question of the conflict or the challenges that often arise between parents and their parents vis-a-vis their children. So I come to you today as a clinician, and then of course, and importantly, I come to you as both a parent of children and as a grandchild. I am presenting today with that background as well. Let's jump right in. You should have some handouts that went around. I don't know if there were enough. Some of you may be asked to share, and I appreciate that. One of the sort of basic hallmark theories, underpinnings of psychology and therapy is that the goal of therapy and the goal of psychology is to make the unconscious conscious. You can't control your behavior until you know that you're doing it in the first place. That's the theory. So why do people come to therapy? Because something's going wrong, something's challenging them, and they don't know what to do to fix it. Through therapy, we figure out why, what's the motivation, why are they doing what they're doing, and we can then start to control that behavior. The theory goes here, I think, as well. I would argue that you need to be aware of what you're doing as a grandparent. I would argue that the same thing goes for parents too. And when I talk to parents, that's the goal of my parenting workshops. You have to understand what goes into being a grandparent, what it means to you to be a grandparent, in order to then be able to be in control of your behavior vis-a-vis your grandchildren. And so that's what our goal is today. Psychologists say that if you look at that first slide, the key is to define your role. Define where this comes from, this idea of being a grandparent. Your sense of self, who you are as a grandparent, psychologists argue comes from the question of, or the place of, what you saw and what you experienced growing up. For those that didn't have grandparents of their own, and we know that the Holocaust disrupted and affected many families, vis-a-vis, and in particular whether children had grandparents at all to relate to. But psychologists would say that's immaterial because we learn through observation also. But the idea being that your understanding of yourself as a grandparent is informed, is formed, its genesis comes from your understanding of grandparents, your experience of grandparents when you were a grandchild yourself. And so first thing to understand in terms of figuring out how to be the best grandparent that I can be, right, has to be, well, what was it like when I was a grandchild? And what did I see around me of my friends and their grandparents? Because that informs how we become who we are. The definition of being a grandparent evolves from being that grandchild or from experiencing the concept of grandchild through our friends. So number one, who am I as a grandparent? How do I decide what I want to do and how I want to be? Depends on what I saw. There's another piece. There was research done, a lot of research done into parenting that looked at why do parents make the choices they make as parents? Where does that come from? And what the research looked at when they interviewed hundreds and hundreds and thousands of parents, what they found was parents said one of two things. It fit into one of two categories. Either I am the parent that I am because I admired the way my parents parented me, and so I want to do what they do. And so it is an active seeking to mimic, to copy, to do that which my parents did for me when I was growing up. The flip side, right, is I hated what my parents did to me. And so I vowed as a child that I would never be that parent. And that informs how they do things. It's a dramatization. It's typically not that global. But I didn't like when my parent did this piece, and I've decided to parent differently. Well, the same thing works as grandparents. There are things that we admire and admired of our grandparents. There are things that we see on TV or with our friends' grandparents, right? The ideal, and that's what I want to be like as a grandparent. Right? And then there are those that say, no, these are the pieces of grandparenting that I didn't like and that I vow to do differently. The argument here and what I'm presenting is that, number one, be aware of where your decisions are coming from. The key to being able to walk out of here and make any changes that if you deem you need to is going to come from first understanding why you're doing it in the first place. And what I am positing is that you are who you are as grandparents because of your lives up until now. And you want to be able to, the degree to which you can identify those factors that form who you are today is the degree that you have control over those behaviors. So let's take a look at what I call the ideal role of grandparent. And when I say ideal, I am juxtaposing it with the real. Because the reality is that in life, right, the ideal is sort of that thing that's out there, right? But it doesn't jive with what my life is like. But this is the ideal. This is the ideal that we see in pop culture. This is the ideal that at many times we dream of being. And let's sort of get this and understand this. And then what I'd like to do is sort of take a look at what are some of the things that get in the way of being the ideal grandparent. Number one, the ideal grandparent is the parent who has the grandparent who has the chance to show unconditional love without the responsibility of discipline. What do I mean? And discipline is going to play a very important role in terms of that fine line that we have to deal with, right? We absolutely have to discipline as grandparents. There are times where we have to tell the kid, don't jump on the couch with your shoes on, right? That's discipline, okay? But you don't have, as grandparents, the responsibility to discipline. That's a parent's responsibility. A parent has a job. A parent's job is to make sure that this kid grows up the way that they should be, whatever that ought to be. And a major piece of getting that kid to there is discipline. It's a fact of life. And as a grandparent, the ideal grandparent doesn't have to do that. The ideal grandparent doesn't have that responsibility on their shoulders. The ideal grandparent gets to shower unconditional love on this child. It's a gift to be able to take that role as different from being a parent. So that's number one, this unconditional love. Number two is the ideal grandparent gets to be a pal. By a pal, I mean somebody who the kid comes and just plays, right? That's the ideal, that your grandchild gets to come to you and be your buddy, gets to play with you, gets to hang with you, gets to experience fun with you. Parents, as you all remember, you don't get to always do that as a parent. The role of parent requires that I'm not your buddy, that I'm not your friend. I'm not talking about a breakdown of respect here. And that's an important differentiation, right? One of the issues that we're seeing in our school system today is this breakdown of the lines, and actually at home as well in my practice, the lines of respect that kids are no longer have with their teachers and their parents. And we're trying to sort of approach that and deal with that because it's becoming increasingly difficult to get kids to understand. I can't tell you how many times in my practice a parent says to me, I don't understand. When I was young, my parents said to do X, I did it. Because who would not do what my parent says? And today, this is all I'm dealing with in therapy, are these teenagers who just refuse to listen to their parents. But here, I'm not talking about losing that sense of respect, but I am talking about the joy of being a friend. Someone you have the ability to be patient with, to take your time with, to play with. One of what I think the most important roles of the ideal grandparent is being a break from the challenges of living at home. I will come out and tell you, I live all of 4 blocks from my in-laws, and when our first was born, we said to them, just know at some day the doorbell is going to ring and she's going to be there with her suitcase. And she's going to say, I'm coming to live with you, right? Because that's an incredibly important role that the grandparent can serve. Again, here living in the same neighborhood, and we'll deal with sort of distance and proximity as an issue later. But being a break, you get to be that place as the ideal where the kid has had it at home and gets to just take a breather. That's something that I've seen a lot in my practice. I had another patient who the teenage son used to basically show up on his grandmother's doorstep once a week saying, I'm tired of my parents. I don't want to deal with them. So that was for me to have to fix and deal with, right? But it was an incredibly important role for the grandmother. She was very happy. She got to do that for him. So being a break. And then, of course, being a role model who's valued and respected. One of the challenges that parents have and that teachers have is keeping their children's respect. And I don't mean the respect that says you're not allowed to curse at me or call me names or call me by my first name, right? I'm not talking about that kind of respect. In life, what we have found in education and in teaching and in parenting is that kids mimic those who they respect. If they respect you, if they think you are worthy of respect, if they think that you are good, then they want to be like you and they want to please you. And what happens is it's the challenge of teachers and parents who have to deal with discipline all the time, who often lose that stature in their children's eyes at different times. And kids who are angry at their parents don't want to respect them and don't want to do what they want and don't want to be like them. You have, because of these pieces, because of the unconditional showering of unconditional love, because of the chance to be a pal, right? You have this unique opportunity to also really model for them values that they're going to suck up, right? Because they respect you. So this is the ideal. This is special, this is unique, and this is the ideal. Unfortunately, reality gets in the way. And what I want to sort of focus on is a couple of different areas that challenge this ideal. And then, of course, I would never leave you without telling you how to fix those things and how to deal with them. Okay? So let's take a look at 3 obstacles to this ideal. Okay? Obstacle number 1, conflict with your children over parenting. Anybody who's been a grandparent has had some experience of disagreeing with their child over how they're parenting the grandchild. Now, everybody deals with it differently, and we'll get to that, but there's going to be some disagreement in there, and that, of course, will conflict with the ability to be this ideal. Number two, there is a need. We have to discipline our grandchildren at some time because we have to keep them safe. If we have certain values and certain beliefs, we want these kids to have those, right? And so discipline and giving rules and having rules and expectations exists, right? And we can't ignore that. But you can see, based on our ideal, how that would get in the way. Theoretically and potentially needing to discipline our grandkids at some point. See, I keep flipping into the pronoun our. All right, it's your. But it's our grandkids, right? So that is going to ultimately, potentially, affect the relationship and affect that ideal. And then the last one is personality conflicts between grandparent and daughter-in-law or son-in-law, right? Many. I just had somebody in my office last week, actually the grandmother in this family structure came to speak to me about conflict she was having with her children, and it was personality conflict, and how to resolve that. Okay, so which was an issue. So those are three obstacles, right? But let's talk about where those obstacles come up and see if they relate to anything that you've experienced in your experience as grandparents as well. So let's talk about conflict over parenting. Here's the issue. Y'all did it already. You've done it. You've parented. You look at your children, and by and large, you've done a pretty good job, right? You did good. And so you sit there and you look at your child parenting their children different than you did, and you have a very good argument to, you know what? You should do it my way. Because theoretically, I've done it. I have the experience. There's no substitute for experience. There is no substitute in this world for experience. And it's not incorrect or invalid to say, I've done this. I've gone through it once. Let me tell you how to do it. Okay? So that's a conflict that we see coming up in family structure all the time. Number two, as a grandparent, when it was your turn to parent, you spent time, energy, money, Jewish education, right? Instilling a set of values in your children. It's what we do in life. And in fact, I would argue that's probably our primary goal as parents, is to teach our children values. And whose values do we teach them? We teach them ours. Right? I just taught my psychology students about the superego. The superego in our unconscious is our conscience. It's what tells us right from wrong. And what Freud said was that the superego starts off when you're very young. Your superego is your parents. Your superego, your eventual conscience develops from what you learn from your parents. Well, we do this. We invest time, money, energy into our children. And now it's valid as a grandparent to stand there, look at what your children are teaching or not teaching your grandchildren, and to worry, is this value going to pass on? Ethics, morals, and religious. One of the things that I hear from parents and grandparents most frequently is their fear of the loss of the religious values that they held, passing on to the next generation. One of the unique issues that we're seeing in today's grandparents, more than in the past generation, is the degree to which parents are relying on their parents to help. More than ever. And a lot of it has to do with the economy. My dissertation was on dual income parents, where both parents had to work, and how they deal with child care and household responsibilities and division of gender roles within the house. And that was my work in my study. And that came out of the reality is that we have many more dual income parents today than we did 50 years ago, 40 and 50 years ago, because we need to. So what's happening? Those parents are in turn, when they live, first of all, they're often choosing to move where their parents live, where the grandparents live, and then they use you, right? They use you. Can you come over and babysit tonight, right? Can you take the kids for the day? I need money, right? They're using you. Now, it's our joy, right? Of course it would be my pleasure, right? But there's a reality. You're being asked to be a part of their lives of these grandchildren in a much more fundamental and constant way, and then you're being asked to butt out. And that's not fair. It creates both an issue of logistics, really. Like, one second, you need me here and you need me to do this and to be with your child for this amount of time, right? And then I'm not allowed to have my input. And then there's also, is it fair, right? But that comes up as a significant challenge for today's grandparents. And then lastly is what I call the definitions of health and safety. Nobody would argue, not one person that I could find would ever argue that if you saw your child doing something with their child that was unsafe, that you don't have a right to say something. If you get into the car with your son, right, and he doesn't make the grandchild buckle up before he pulls away, you stand right up, you get out of the car, and you say, we're not going anywhere. Everybody agrees. What's the question? Who defines what's an issue of safety and health? My doctor said that you never give a kid a bottle at night in the bed because it decays their teeth. And my kid is letting their kid do that. Is that an issue of health and safety? Do we all agree that that's something where I should absolutely speak up? Right? That's the question. So it's not a question of should you speak up, but it's a question of when should you speak up and who defines what's a safe issue and what's a health issue. Right? I don't let kids jump on the couch. My kid lets them jump on the couch. They're going to fall off and break their head. Right? So I want to tell them to stop. So here's the issue. Conflict over parenting has the potential to affect your relationship with your grandchild. Has the chance, the potential, to remove us from this ideal. So how do we deal with that? That's issue number one. Issue number two is, fact is, you need to discipline your grandchildren sometimes. This unconditional love without the responsibility to discipline is all nice and good, but it can't be a free-for-all. And that can be very dangerous. Question number one, I'm babysitting for my grandchild. Do I have to mimic my child's rules and discipline? Can I be more lax? Can I be more strict? Okay, that's a potential issue in terms of how you discipline and how your grandchild will experience you. Number two, I think, is something that's very dear to me. One would argue, based on my first slide, that it probably has something to do with my own childhood. But we won't go there now, that we won't shrink the shrink at the moment. But I think that when it comes to relationship is very important to me. And I deal in my practice a lot with repairing relationship. The question of what will my grandchild feel? What will their visceral reaction be when they hear grandpa, when they hear saba, when they hear safta? What will their sort of, their gut reaction be? Well, what do I want them to feel? Right? That's a key question that then affects your ability to discipline your grandchild. How I discipline, what I choose to discipline, what words I use, what my tone of voice is, right? All has to do with how I want them to walk away from my house feeling. And it creates a tension. It creates a tension. And lastly, the role of disciplinarian is very different. You know, as I was thinking about this, what I started when I was working on this workshop, what I started thinking of was this clear line. Parents have to be the disciplinarians. Grandparents don't have to be. It's like joy in life, and it's great. And what I realized is that's not really what I wanted to say, because I don't think it's accurate. What's accurate, the distinction is that parents and the role of disciplinarian for parents and grandparents is very different. Parents have to be consistent. Parents have to discipline consistently. Because I'll tell you, the one time, right, that I let my kid come downstairs and watch TV before he's dressed and ready for school, he'll use that against me every time. Right? You let me last time. Okay? Parents have a job that requires them to be consistent in their discipline. Grandparents, discipline plays a very different role. Discipline is about keeping the kids safe. Discipline is about instilling values. But inherent in grandparent discipline is the ability to sort of, be a little lax sometimes. To be able to be that person who can say to your kid, you know what, this time I'll let you. It's okay. We'll make a special rule in grandma's house, on Thursdays, right, that you can do this. And you don't have to be consistent in your discipline the way that parents do. But again, what's the challenge? The challenge is knowing when you can be lax, when you can play around a little bit, right? And making sure, as we're going to see later, that you don't undermine the parents, because that'll screw everything up. And then the last thing that we looked at was conflicts in style. What I called sort of personality conflicts, and now what I'm calling conflicts in style. Teachers, anybody here an educator? Great. I have something that I call the teacher's dilemma. The teacher's dilemma goes like this. You're sitting there, tell me, any of you teachers, tell me if this has ever happened to you. There's a test on Tuesday, and the kid comes in on Tuesday as the test's about to start and says, I'm not ready for the test. Right? I had my sister's wedding yesterday, okay, and the day before that was, preparing for the wedding, and I'm not ready. And now you've got a problem, okay? You like the kid is responsible, the kid gets good grades, okay? We're not talking about one of these kids who weasels out of stuff, right? You've got a decision to make. Do I solve this for the kid? Do I say to the kid, all right, look, you had a tough time, you know what? Take it tomorrow. Please, I trust you. You're not a cheater. Don't talk to the other kids about the test. Take it tomorrow. Do you give the kid the solution, right? Or do you say, what do you think you ought to do about it? Right? How are we going to solve the problem? Do you make the kid come up with the answer themselves? The teacher's dilemma is we are programmed as parents and as teachers to solve our children's problems. We want them to be happy. And very often that leads us to solving their problems. But there's a lot to gain from them having to figure it out themselves. And so part of that decision is pedagogic. How do I want to teach my children? But part of it is their personality. Is my child one who likes to try new things and likes to experiment and then figure it out for themselves? Or is my child the one who always comes and says, what should I do? How do I do this? So conflicts in style is what's your style and what's your child or in-law's style? Child-in-law's style, right? Am I someone who likes to teach and likes to give the answer? Or am I someone who likes to sort of stand back, let my kid experiment, and then jump in when they need me? Right? And what's my child like, and what does my child need? So understanding those differences affects our ability to be effective grandparents. And then, of course, adjusting to a new family, right? It's probably the only thing less natural than a man and woman who grew up in totally different houses deciding to live together is what the parents are supposed to do when this whole new family comes together. I do a workshop and I do therapy with new couples, either who are about to be married or are recently married. Just to sort of, it's a 3-session, hits on a couple topics, because I tell them on day one, there is nothing stranger than two people who have such different backgrounds, coming from totally different places with totally different values, right? Deciding, oh yeah, no, we love each other, we can now live together, no problem. And helping them adjust to that. Well, for the parents and the grandparents, I mean, it's a whole nother slew of things, right? Having to figure, because now what happens, my values that I taught to my children, right, are now have to be sort of adjusted to this new person who came into the house. And what does that mean for the things that are important to me? And the things that I spent all this time doing? Let alone the machatanim, right? Now we've got this other set of grandparents. And what does that spike in me? What does that do to me? Right? Does it make me feel jealous? Right? Is the other one getting more time with the grandchildren than I am? Am I present enough? Wow, they live right next to them and I live, 50 miles away. What does that do? How does that affect how you react to them? Okay? So these are all pieces. These are all pieces that interfere. These are all pieces that potentially get in the way. And what we need to do is figure out, all right, so how do I make sure none of this happens, right? Or better, let's be a little bit more real, right? How do we minimize this kind of stuff from happening in our own families? As we go through what I call the answers, I think most of you who are grandparents already will recognize that you do much of this. The stuff that you don't do, you'll recognize that you're not doing it. And the question will be for you to figure out, do I do this or don't I? And is it conscious or not? Right? And if it's a conscious decision, understanding why you're not doing it. And then you can make a decision, walking out of here, whether it's something you want to do. So let's take a look at some of these answers. The research into grandparenting, and believe it or not, there's quite a bit of research into grandparenting. Quite a bit. My gut is that it is what drives most of this country right now. It's the baby boomers, right, who became grandparents and are still becoming grandparents, that are driving much of it. But there's quite a bit of research, and what's very interesting about grandparenting research is how much it all jives with each other. If I do research into, ADHD, right, there are probably 30 different perspectives on whether ADHD is real or not real, and is it overdiagnosed, and is it this, and should we use medicine, or should... When it comes to grandparenting, the research is actually fairly cohesive. So one of the pieces that comes out quite a bit is this line number 1. The grandparent's role is not to challenge, but to fit in with the family culture. It's the role of grandparents. Your role is not to challenge your children's decisions and your children's family culture. It's not to get in there and say, this is all wrong, this is unacceptable, this is not appropriate. In general, because we're going to deal with obviously the exceptions to the rule, the grandparent's role is to fit in. A parent doesn't have to fit in with the way that their child is doing something, right? That's not their job. But unfortunately, or fortunately, for grandparents, the role is very different. Why is it your role to fit in and not to be a challenge? Because if we challenge too much, we become excluded. You become excluded. And the last thing that you want is to be excluded. Does it mean that you lay down and let them roll all over you? Of course not. And you have to know where you draw the line. But the constellation, the sort of the context under which grandparents need to think about their interaction with their children's families is one of fitting in and not of challenging. We'll talk more about that. Yes, please. Sure, absolutely. I always say I reserve the right to say we'll hold off, but please. I had a feeling. What? No, I'm not that good. Tell me what it is that you're not comfortable with.
To be argumentative or do it in a nasty way or in front of the kid even, but to completely ignore it, I would not agree with.
Good. I'm happy you said that. because I think that it's one of the points that I will get to and that I was sort of hinting at. So you picked up on what I knew I needed to get to because I think you're right. Like I said, you can't ask a grandparent, you can't ask anybody in any system to lay down and close their eyes when they see something that seems wrong. What I'm speaking to is sort of the larger picture. In other words, the role of a teacher is to challenge kids. That's the role of a teacher. To listen for every little thing that they miss and to catch them on it so that they learn. That's the role. A parent has to watch that child, right? And has to be on top of them all the time. What a grandparent's role is a little bit different. Because the grandparent starts off, unfortunately, grandparents start off as at a disadvantage, right? Right away, many grandparents are held in suspicion, and a lot of, like I was saying, a lot of kids feel like their parents are watching them, or, okay, now let me see, they're going to tell me, my parents are going to tell me that I'm doing this wrong because they did it, right? What we need, so then what your job is the term we use is banking our credit. That's what it is. Well, there's in social psychology, when it comes to boardrooms, or they use it a lot in jury deliberation. They say, you want to have an effect? What you do is you bide your time. You watch. You listen. You observe. You collect data. You agree. You fit. Because what happens is people learn you're banking your credit. And at some point, something's going to happen and you're going to want to step up and say something. And when you've done that, you can cash in your credit. So when I say a grandparent's job is to fit in and not to challenge, what I mean is the nature of your interaction in general with your children is to fit in. What do you need me to do? How do you want me to do it? How do you do it? Because the more you do that, then when the time comes to put your foot down, you can pull out the credit and say, listen, everything that we do, I agree with, I'm with you. Here's something that I'll tell you why I disagree or why I think it ought to be different. So that's what I'm getting at with that line, okay? Be a ready source of advice when asked. It goes along with what we're saying, right? Right? You're there. Again, you have the experience. Nobody can argue that you've got more experience than your children when they have children. And you have so much information in your head of what you've tried and what you haven't tried. I teach 2 sections of psychology at school right now. And I love it because my first class is the one I experiment on, right? And then I listen to their questions so that when I give it to the next class, I'm on top of it and I can sort of hit those things. So you've done it. You know what, you've tried it. It hasn't worked. It's worked. But a basic, fundamental idea in advice giving is that it's much more effective when people ask us for it than when we volunteer it. So be prepared to give it. But the more you can wait and put it off until they ask you, the more it will be received from them. Communication, we could do a whole workshop on communication. Communication is my sort of raison d'etre. It's the focus of my entire practice. All of my talks and workshops really focus around the concept of communication. I think that the solution to any issue, almost any issue, right, in life, is communication. If we could figure out how to talk to each other, we could solve 90% of the world's problems. So when I work with parents and schools figuring out how to communicate, parents and kids, teachers and students, spouses, it's all about communication. The key is you've got to communicate. The worst thing you can do is be upset and keep it to yourself. Okay, I should probably hold back. It's good to calm down and then to talk about it, right? You got to know how to do it. In the marriage workshop, I always talk about this idea of it's okay to go to sleep angry, right? Because the theory was always never go to bed angry, right? And so I sort of throw that out the window. If you're going to attack, then it's better to go to sleep angry, sleep on it, relax, and then the next morning be able to communicate about it. So it's the same thing here. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Do it right, and we can always talk about that in another workshop, but it's important. Don't hold it in, because if you hold it in, it just pops up in lots of different passive-aggressive ways. So be able to be ready to talk about it. And then the key is know how to intervene. So here are some communication skills. You want to intervene? That's fine. You guys have a lot to give, right? So how are we going to do it? Number one, never start a sentence with "you should." Tends to shut down the person who's hearing you. Never start with "you should." There are lots of other words you can use to get into it, right? You should put somebody on the defensive right away. Ask, "Can I help?" Right? Asking, "Can I help?" means that you're opening up the answer to be yes or no, right? So hopefully they'll say, "Yes, thank you," right? They're juggling 3 kids, and this one's running around, and this one's ripping their pajamas off when they're supposed to be going to bed, and this one's peeing on the floor. Can I help? Right? You are opening up the potential for them to say no, and then you need to be able to figure out what you're going to do, okay? But ask, "Can I help?" It's a great way of letting your child come to you. It's a great way. It breaks down the defenses because they feel like now they have the option of saying yes or no. So I always start with, "Can I help?" Yes?
How about instead of saying, "Can I help?" what I say is, "How can I help?"
Great.
That's better than "I don't get a no."
That's great. That's actually a very, I like, right. How can I help? Or what was that one? What can I do to help?
Right.
So what you're doing is you're throwing yourselves at them, right? And you're saying, "I'm at your disposal," which once again, I think what that does is, I like that, because what that does is it allows them to still get that sense of they're telling you what they need, right? But it doesn't open up to no, right? We do testing. I do psychological testing. And one of the things they teach you when you do psych testing is you never say to the kids, "Should we go on to the next page?" Because then they go, no, and you're done, right? So you don't open it up. You say, let's try number 7, right? And you move on. So that's good. And probably, I think, one of the most challenging pieces for everybody sitting here, the most challenging piece, because it's challenging for parents, teachers, and grandparents, is supporting your children even when you think they're making a decision that you would not make. Now again, not when they're doing something dangerous. We're leaving that aside. Okay? But when your kid says, when you say to your child, you let them go to bed with the bottle in their crib at night, and the kid says, "Yeah, it's fine, it's fine." You say, "Okay." Say, "All right, do you want me to go get the bottle?" Right? You do it. You support them. Why is that so important? It's important because when your kid feels that you support them, then they can come to you later and say, "This didn't really work." And you can go, "Aha." Right? But what happens is if your children feel criticized by you, then they can't admit that there's a mistake later. Right? They're shamed. And so they won't admit to you that they're having trouble or that there's a problem. Because it means admitting that you were right and they were wrong. And I'm sorry, that doesn't stop at teenage years. Right? It goes on forever. Right? So when you are supportive and say, "All right, let's give it a shot. Let me help. How can I do that with you?" Right? Then it allows them to later come back and on their own feel unthreatened and able to say, talk to you about it, which then gives you the in to give your advice. Okay? Probably the most important thing, though, in that idea is that you don't bear resentment that they're not listening to you or doing it your way. See, what happens very often is that we give our advice, and our children don't listen to us, and then we're like, "All right, let's see what happens to you now." Right? And that's not helpful. Right? Because you don't want your children to fail, and you don't want them to be in pain. And so it's important that even when your children are not following what you want them to, that you be ready to jump in and help them when they need it. And that you don't bear that sort of resentment that leads to passive-aggressive, behavior. A couple more. And this is very, very important. Children need to know who's running the show. They need to know who's in charge. And this is something I beg grandparents to keep in mind. Children need to know who's in charge. They need to know because when the expectations are not clear, when they don't know, is this something I'm allowed to do or something I'm not allowed to do, it makes them confused and it makes for anxiety. Anxiety is, psychologically speaking, anxiety is the result of not knowing what to do or what's coming. So, parents are the boss. That's when, now if we go back to our earlier line, parents are the boss. You fit in, you don't challenge. With the following exceptions. Number one, if the kids are staying with you, now you're the boss. The research actually makes a very interesting distinction between kids, your grandkids coming for a couple of hours versus your grandkids coming for a week or for the summer or for a month or even overnight. Right? What they say is in the short term, you're the boss. Right? There's also a distinction between your home and the parents' home. Right? You're allowed to have grandma and grandpa's rules of our house. But what they say is the research seems to point to short term, have fun with it. Do what you want to do. The kids don't get dessert before dinner and you want to because it's special dinner once a week at grandma's house. Go for it. Enjoy it. But when your grandchildren are with you for longer term, then the research points to the need to go along with what the parents' rules are. If homework comes before TV, then homework has to come before TV. If showers come before story time, then showers come before story time. Because what happens is, and the worst is when you say, and I've heard grandparents say to their grandchildren, forget what mommy and daddy says, you're here, this is great, right? When you do that, it confuses the children. And what that leads to, what does anxiety in children lead to? It leads to acting out behavior, it leads to poor behavior, it leads to anger, it leads to all sorts of stuff. So, the parents are in charge. They're the rule, they set the standards. You have times where you're allowed to play with those, but not if they undermine what the parents are getting at. Because if the parents are not clear, if the kids are not clear, they are the ones in pain. And you don't want them in pain. Endless discipline undermines unconditional love. I have no doubt, right? It's what I said at the beginning. As a grandparent, you love your grandchildren. You just, by definition, you love them. They're great. And you want to shower them with love. And you want them to know that you love them so that when they walk away and they hear grandpa and grandma or saba and savta, they get that warm, cuddly feeling inside. If you are disciplining, don't do that and take your feet off of there and we don't watch that show and we don't do that. It masks it. It hides it. They don't get that sense from you anymore. It hides what it is that you know you really feel to them. It has nothing to do with what you intend. It has to do with how they receive it. And too much discipline and too much correction masks and hides what it is that you're trying so hard to give them, which is this sense of love. Different rules for different places. I'm a big fan of that, right? You're allowed to say, grandpa's house is different, grandma's house is different, right? And we have little differences from home. And then, of course, what you have to be aware of is what we were talking about before, when you're in loco parentis, right? When you are the parent. There's a statistic, you know what, I should have brought it with me. It's not just in our community. Worldwide, it's something like, countrywide, it's something like 10% of grandparents are basically acting as parents these days. It's a very high number, actually, to think that 1 out of every 10 families is truly the grandparents that are parenting. But this idea of obviously distinguishing between when you're visiting as a grandparent and when you're playing the role of parent, and obviously that calls for different approaches and different ways of disciplining. I also, by the way, when I give a talk to parents, I tell them that just as I ask grandparents to support the parents' rules in the parents' house, so if the kid is jumping on the couch and you're over visiting and the kid is jumping on the couch and the parents are okay with it, you don't stop them. I mean, again, unless you think it's dangerous, right? But no, that's a rule. That's fine. You have got to be able to support what your children are doing in their home. I flip it, though, for the parents. When they're visiting your house, you got your rules, and they have to support those rules because that's grandma and grandpa's rules. Folks, I'll end with sort of one thing that I saw in one of the research studies had a line that was very meaningful. You're going back to the concept of your relationship with your children. Your children are the gatekeepers to a successful relationship with your grandchildren. Your children are the gatekeepers to a successful relationship with your grandchildren. And so that is probably the single best argument for being very conscious, which is what I'm arguing for, and aware of when you speak up and what you speak up about. Because the single largest complaint I get in my practice from grandparents is that my children won't let me see my grandchildren. And when we get into the family therapy of that, it often comes down to a feeling like the parent saying, my parent, right, is critical, is not understanding, undermines me, and I don't want them around. Okay? So it behooves us to be aware of what's driving us, what's making us as grandparents make the choices that we're making, which allows us to then critically evaluate whether we should be speaking up at certain times. Right? And lastly, to then use the tools that we have in order to be able to interact positively and get the experience that we have and the values across to our children. Are there any questions at all? Any comments? Yes. Please.
I found the secret to parenting are 3 words.
Go ahead.
And they are, oh, that's nice. When your children tell you what they decided to do with your grandchildren, the best thing you can say to them is, oh, that's nice. Because they're going to do it anyway. And if you say anything else, then when you're not in earshot of them, you can scream out loud or you can tell your husband.
How could they do that?
You know, but I know one example, and how I learned it was one of my first grandchildren born. The children decided to take their new baby, my grandchild, to Disney,
Yes.
Florida, at 1 month old. So because the child needed them, and I forced myself with all my being to say, oh, that's nice. Have a safe trip.
There you go.
And then I went berserk.
Right. Right. You know what? That story is great because it exemplifies so many of the pieces that are here, right? It's exactly what we're talking about being supportive, right? When they come back and the kid is sick because it was on the plane with no immune system, you could say, oh, I wondered about that, But that's also a great example of the line before about the role is to fit in and not to challenge, so that you have the power later. Yes. Don't forget what? Zaidi. I have fair. In our family, I think we have a Zaidi, a Saba, we have a Safti and a Safta, and I've got fair. A Bubby. I've got a Bubby. So yes, that's fair. I guess I have to now have my list and make sure I cover them all. Fair comment. All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your patience. Yes, I do. I hope I do.
As Rabbi Brzezinski said, one of the joys of living a long life and one of the challenges is grandparenting. And we are very, very pleased today to have somebody who's very dear and close to us at the OU. He happens to be a Teaneck resident. His practice is in Passaic. He is a regular at our annual marriage enhancement retreat that the OU runs. Alex's sessions are always overfilled because people, once they hear him once, want to always go back. His insight and his wisdom are legendary, at least among us at the OU. And we were thrilled that when we put this program together, Alex was able to give us some time. I'm sure you'll all find him incredibly, will give you a lot of insights that I hope will be helpful. It's really, I really want to thank him for being here, and it's a pleasure to introduce Alex Bailey.
Let me start by clarifying something that may not be clear. I'm not a grandparent, okay? I acknowledge that, and I come to you today not as a grandparent. When I give workshops, most often I'm giving workshops to some level of my peer group. So when I'm talking at the marriage retreat, I'm married. And when I give workshops in the school system to teachers and do teacher training, I educate, and I'm a teacher as well. And of course, the very successful initiative by the OU and their parenting initiative, their positive parenting initiative, as a parent, I get the privilege of talking to parents as well. Today, I present myself to you from two other perspectives. Number one is as a clinician. In my private practice, I do a lot of work with teenagers and then a lot of work with families. And one of the things that most often comes up, or at least very frequently comes up with the parents during our family sessions, are issues of dealing with their parents vis-a-vis the place of what you saw and what you experienced growing up. For those that didn't have grandparents of their own, and we know that the Holocaust disrupted and affected many families vis-a-vis, and in particular how whether children had grandparents at all to relate to. But psychologists would say that's immaterial because we learn through observation also. But the idea being that your understanding of yourself as a grandparent is informed, is formed, its genesis comes from your understanding of grandparents, your experience of grandparents when you were a grandchild yourself. And so first thing to understand in terms of figuring out how to be the best grandparent that I can be, right, has to be, well, what was it like when I was a grandparent, when I was a grandchild? And what did I see around me of my friends and their grandparents? Because that informs how we become who we are. The definition of being a grandparent evolves from being that grandchild, or from experiencing the concept of grandchild through our friends. Children. So the question of the conflict or the challenges that often arise between parents and their parents vis-a-vis their children. So I come to you today as a clinician, and then of course, and importantly, I come to you as both a parent of children and as a grandchild. I am presenting today with that background as well. Let's jump right in. You should have some handouts that went around. I don't know if there were enough. Some of you may be asked to share, and I appreciate that. One of the sort of basic hallmark theories, underpinnings of psychology and therapy is that the goal of therapy and the goal of psychology is to make the unconscious conscious. You can't control your behavior until you know that you're doing it in the first place. That's the theory. So why do people come to therapy? Because something's going wrong, something's challenging them, and they don't know what to do to fix it. Through therapy, we figure out why, what's the motivation, why are they doing what they're doing, and we can then start to control that behavior. The theory goes here, I think, as well. I would argue that you need to be aware of what you're doing as a grandparent. I would argue that the same thing goes for parents too. And when I talk to parents, that's the goal of my parenting workshops. You have to understand what goes into being a grandparent, what it means to you to be a grandparent, in order to then be able to be in control of your behavior vis-a-vis your grandchildren. And so that's what our goal is today. Psychologists say that if you look at that first slide, the key is to define your role. Define where this comes from, this idea of being a grandparent. Your sense of self, who you are as a grandparent, psychologists argue comes from the question of, or